Hello to everyone who's joined us today. It's good to see you and that you've been interacting in our chat. My name is Gina and I am the President for University Services and the Student Advice Center at Studee. I've been on the international education industry for over 20 years. I am currently based in Ecuador, where our International Student Advice Center is located. From here, we advise students from all over who are searching for their study abroad program and destination. At Studee, we believe that every student has the opportunity to study abroad, and to achieve this, we support students in finding, applying, and enrolling at a university. We provide two services. One is the pay as you go service, or our recruitment service, which helps you enroll more international students by finding students looking to study abroad and matching them to your institution, and our conversion service, which will help your institution enroll more students of your own international student leads, the applications and admitted students or offer holders too, helping you to maximize your marketing efforts and the human resource and the conversion rates too. I am really excited to share this webinar today with Francisco Marmolejo. Francisco is the president of the higher education at the Qatar Foundation for Education, Science, and Community Development in Doha. Francisco, welcome. I'll let you to introduce yourself and what you do at Qatar Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gina. It's a real pleasure participating today. I'm originally from Mexico, although I live now, 14,000 kilometers away from my country, in Doha, Qatar. Qatar Foundation is a very unique ecosystem of global higher education institutions based at Education City, which make of Education City the largest of its kind globally, of a multi-university, multi-campus, multi-country, and multidisciplinary programs that are being offered since more than 20 years ago here, including several universities in the U.S., Carnegie Mellon, Texas A&M, Georgetown University, Cornell University, Virginia Commonwealth University, and Northwestern University, among the institutions that are working and based here in Doha, Qatar. So I serve as president of higher education here, as the unit that precisely provides all the support to those institutions in order for them to work in a more collaborative way. But I have been all my life dedicated to higher education. 40 years.
I know, it's great.
Working from Mexico, US, Canada, working at the World Bank and universities in the US, and also more recently at the World Bank, and recently living in India. So now here in Doha.
Just a world traveler on the international education industry. Thank you very much, Francisco. Let's kick off on today's webinar. On the background, Ellie, if you can help me out, I cannot see Francisco anymore. So if you could check on that, that would be awesome too. Great, so let's get started. COVID. It turned the international education sector upside down and potentially forevermore. It virtually halted all the student mobility. It shut schools, colleges, embassies, language test centers, and it forced many foreign students to delay or even abandon their initial plans. All these financial implications of the pandemic have been catastrophic, if we say it this way, for higher education institutions across the globe. Many international and study abroad offices have lost, with providers experiencing the greatest number of layoffs and closures because of the loss of revenue. And I do have to say, despite their best efforts, 59% of universities reported recruiting either significantly or slightly fewer international students in the 2019-2020 academic year. And this is a huge blow to all these institutions that rely on international student tuition fees for a good chunk of the revenue as well. However, mass testing, vaccine rollouts, lifting restrictions, and lowering transmission rates have presented a beacon of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel, if we want to call it this way. And what's been a time of terrible darkness all these times. So could university go back to normal? And more importantly, do we want it to? I know that Francisco has to offer a little bit more of insight on what's been such a turbulent 18 months or so for the international education industry. Francisco, I believe you've got some slides prepared, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Gina. And, in fact, what I will present precisely sort of reinforces some of the things that you are precisely mentioning right now. So let me just make sure that the slides are, I guess you can see that screen right now, right? So, basically what I like to start mentioning is that, I remember when I was an adolescent.
Francisco, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I don't believe we can see your slides.
Really? Interesting. Let me try again. And please tell me if you can see them now. You can see? Can you see the screen right now?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, very good. So I was mentioning that when I was an adolescent, teenager, I used to read Reader's Digest, which is a journal that it was one of the few opportunities that back in those years we have to understand what it was going to happen in the world. So there was a section there named was called Quotable Quotes, and I remember grabbing this quote that for some reason stayed in my mind. When I think about the future, I become concerned about the present, and it looks like today it is precisely a type of a quotable quote that it will reflect the anxiety and many of the things that we face today. There are good news, Gina. There is good news. The good news is that there is no doubt that we live in a world that it is increasingly connected, integrated, educated, and of course that it is a fertile land for more and better higher education. The challenging news, I might say, is that, as you indicated before, we don't know how the dramatic, social, economic, political, and technological shift that the world is experiencing right now will impact higher education. And of course, let me just, remember that this is not something new. Back in 1997, Peter Drucker, he was making the point. He said, universities will not survive. Higher education is in crisis. The college campus won't survive as a residential institution because today universities are hopelessly unsuited and totally unneeded. Was he talking about the pandemic? Or was he talking something despite the pandemic? Was he exaggerating? Or was he making the point about that the need for higher education to more quickly adapt to the realities and challenges of today's world? For sure, the pandemic was something fully unexpected. I don't think anybody can say that we were prepared for that. And, I never imagined in my life that in a relatively period of time, just in few months, the entire educational system in the world was paralyzed. Institutions of higher education were forced to address the urgent while delaying the important. Surveys conducted, for instance, in the US among presidents of higher education institutions were clearly indicating that, as presidents or leaders, they were just paying attention to the most urgent themes. And as you can see here, international students were not precisely on the top of the list. I might say they were on the bottom line of the list. So just to give an idea of the significant magnitude of this, we are talking about more than 200 million students globally who were unable to continue their education. We are talking about 70% of international students who disappeared from the map, creating a problem for the 30% who stayed at home, abroad, which many times they were facing significant challenges of both economic and even some cases even harassment. And of course, we are also mindful of the fact that not all the higher education institutions in the world were able to continue the teaching, learning, delivery. In fact, 40% globally still had been, after a year and a half, unable to continue their education. Of course, there are some lessons learned out of this. The first one is that we were not properly prepared. Second is that the environment in which we operate in higher education is much more fragile than we could imagine. Third, that online education is good, it's a good short-term solution, but it's not the long-term solution. that leadership in higher education should be different and should be prepared to address crisis as it was not expected. That many of the challenges that existed in higher education before the pandemic didn't disappear. They stay there, and still they are much more acute today. But one lesson learned that, in my opinion, is very, very important, is very positive one, is that also the crisis has allowed us to be much more mindful in challenging our assumptions, in challenging our dogmas about what is good and what is bad in higher education. So this is where I see hope, where I see opportunities. In terms of internationalization, Jihna, you were mentioning that, students and the idea of international education really was not any more interesting. In fact, I use this Google search worldwide in terms of popularity of terms, and you can see clearly that online courses became the very popular thing, while study abroad literally disappeared from the map. And of course, in some cases, the impact has been very dramatic. Look at the case of Australia. In the case of Australia, you find a number of institutions that for which international students represented almost a half of the enrollment of those institutions. Are there implications of that? Of course. Just take a look into the newspapers in Australia, and it will show very clearly that the impact is becoming really, really significant on the capacity of those institutions to deliver, and in some cases even to survive. In the United States, it was something similar. Even before the pandemic, as you indicate, Jihna, problems were there. But of course, after the pandemic, it was very clear that international students were not longer will I be able to continue part of the fabric. Now, what are the short-term implications of this? The first one is there is fewer amount of money available in economies, governments, and families, and for sure that has implications in higher education. There is higher dropout rates in higher education, increased number of students postponing their studies. There are fewer international students, at least for this, for the last cycle, and most likely most of this cycle. And of course, there is, an unavoidable impact on research, among other things. So in terms of financials, it is very clear, you can see here, that not all the institutions are in the best shape to be able to survive the crisis. This analysis being made shows very clearly that if there are institutions whose value proposition is relatively low, and also whose a sort of cushion, if you want, of a financial capacity they have is low, are those institutions that are really in jeopardy, not only to become less relevant, but even in some cases to survive. You can recognize there some names of institutions which really have been in big trouble. Just to give an idea of the magnitude that the crisis has had in higher education, look at this. There have been more than 600,000 jobs in higher education in the US who have been lost due to the pandemic. So, of course, this is something completely unexpected a time ago. Were we prepared? Not really. We were not really prepared. Teachers had to quickly adapt to new ways of teaching. Even in some cases, parents also had to adapt. In the case of those who have kids know that very well. And of course, there are significant challenges ahead. The first one is how to minimize the student learning deficit that it has happened due to the transition of line. How to reduce inequality due to the technological gap. How to make sure that students keep interested, motivated, and in good mental health. How to evaluate the teaching and learning. And of course, how to mitigate the impact of the financial implications. Different studies show very clearly that the online environment is not precisely, the magical solution, because many students are not really engaged. In fact, different studies like this one made in Mexico shows that students, the great majority of students, express negative opinions about the sort of the online courses. Faculty members as well, as this study conducted at Yale University shows that also faculty members experience those type of complications. And of course, the problem is that for a lot of people, the idea was that transitioning from the classroom to the Zoom, it will be relatively easy. But as sarcastically Coslin indicates, lectures are a wonderful way to teach, but a terrible way to learn. Now, of course, also we have learned very interesting things in a relatively short period of time. We learned, for instance, that the time of teaching should be reduced, that the learning should be meaningful, that digital pedagogy should be used, that students should be engaged, otherwise they won't learn, that we should make sure that the learning utilizes methods that allows them to build more knowledge, and also that teachers have to continue being students in order to learn new things. So currently, the world of higher education is experiencing the largest social experiment in our lifetime. We should take the opportunity to really sort of learn from that in order to improve higher education. It is a new reality that we like it or not, we need to see with different lenses. And of course, the big question is if COVID-19 pandemic will change the modus of operandi of higher education and research. And I'm sure that all of you will agree with me that for sure it will change. You know, there are different scenarios that higher education institutions are heading to experience and explore in order to continue with some kind of normal, regular education. Distance education is also something that now it is part of the reality. How do we cope and take advantage of that? How long institutions will be able to not have students? Again, some institutions may be in problems. So in summary, I think if we look at the future, as I mentioned before, also this is a great opportunity to question some of our dogmas and some of our assumptions. Is internationalization only about foreign students? Do we know what really our students are learning? Are rankings as important as we think? What is education about? So all of those elements, today we can challenge all of those assumptions because it looks like there is a unique momentum in which there is kind of alignment of the planets, in which we can take opportunity and think about new schools of thought, as we propose in this report that we prepared with economists at Qatar Foundation. There are different innovative models that can be explored by institutions. More hybrid learning, more clustering of institutions, as we do in Qatar Foundation, more experiential education, more partnerships with other institutions, and of course, more emphasis on interdisciplinary in the learning. So the big question is, are higher education institutions just reacting, emulating, or proactively engaged in fostering change? Well, that is up to each of the institutions. And I think this is, again, a great opportunity for us to rethink, reimagine, and of course, redesign higher education. So those are my initial sort of reflections, Gina. And then, of course, now I'm ready to engage in a conversation with you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. That was incredibly interesting. A lot of food for thought as well. And I'm sure your observations resonated with many of our audience members. It has definitely been a crazy year and a half. This pandemic has generated a lot of uncertainty. And with this, I'll now like to dive into some of the hottest topics for discussion and the main challenges that our industry is currently facing. For our audience members, if you'd like to ask anything, please do pop in the question box any of your questions, and at the end we'll try, if time allows, to get these answered for you. So my first topic and the first questions that I like to run through is addressing the testing and the vaccines. So most people are optimistic about the introduction of the vaccines, viewing them as a passport as well back to normality. However, many college age individuals remain skeptical about the taking the vaccine, questioning is this is a necessity, and fearing over potential long-term health effects. Unfortunately, university campuses are hotbeds, of course, for the spread of COVID-19 strains, and share housing, learning, all of the recreational facilities that students have, this make transmission almost inevitable, right? So on one hand, you've got an immunized campus that could attract more students because it'll be safer, fewer restrictions, livelier social events, and on the other hand, universities that announce vaccine requirement policies could also risk losing students due to a vaccine refusal. So let me just bring in a question here. Like experts predict that university vaccine policies will have a huge influence on the popularity among international students. Will the vaccine policies chosen by universities affect their reputation, the attractiveness, and the students' application decisions? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, and we are seeing that. I should tell you. I think, of course, there's going to be a dent, if you want, in the sort of in the decision making of the students as they think about what institution go and what institution to consider. But honestly, I don't think that is going to be sort of the factor deciding if a student wants to go to institution A or institution B. A disclosure in my case is that I got my second shot of the vaccine 3.5 months ago, and I have survived. And I don't think that nothing has changed in my, that is going to be a challenge. But there is no doubt that institutions are facing that challenge. Even institutions that already have made a decision about a mandatory vaccination for students returning during the fall, even in that case, there are significant implications. What to do with students that, due to medical reasons, cannot be vaccinated? What about the students that, due to religious reasons, cannot be vaccinated? How to cope with that? What is the process in place? So you find, for instance, institutions that have decided that, let's say, for instance, I want to, I will accept the possibility of exceptions in my institution. Then how to assure that? Just by a letter by the physician, or just by a letter of the leader of the religious organization to which I am affiliated with, et cetera, et cetera. So those are many of the significant ramifications that institutional decisions on that matter have. I think, I have the impression that, at the end of the day, sort of rationality will prevail, and that, students, will have limited options, and that, also we in higher education can exercise a much more responsible sort of collective behavior in making sure that, following the advice of science, we can make the point that by having larger number of students being vaccinated, most likely it is going to be possible, of course, to have the opportunity to have a much more real, normal life in our institutions. And don't forget about the fact that also we need to do work with the faculty members and the staff. Yes. Again, here in the case of Qatar Foundation, all students, faculty member, and staff have received the opportunity to vaccinate before the end of this academic term. So in theory, it is supposed that based on the policy that we already are adopting in mandating vaccination, that we will be able to resume some kind of normal operations for the next fall. And we are seeing that happening also with many institutions in the world.
Yes, most of the international students as well are at the bottom of the priority list for vaccinations, and some students might have this vaccine skeptic. So, do you believe this could cause also logistical problems? As you say, it could be even their religious, their beliefs as well. That it's going to cause a logistic problem for a university too.
No doubt about it. I can tell you because we convene a complete task force to deal with this. And, there are significant implications in many ways. As I mentioned to you, logistically from the standpoint of academic courses, housing. What about the students, international students that are coming from countries that don't have vaccination at this point? What about international students that are coming from countries in which mandatory quarantine is required, or even the case of international students that cannot travel because they are in countries which are having or experiencing higher rates of contagious and that are classified as the red code countries. So, of course, all those are implications. So, something that I have seen very exciting to see that in many universities, this has really put, forced, if you want, to put together all different entities that usually don't talk each other a lot to finally work collectively in order to tackle some of the potential variations of the problem in order to be more effectively prepared. Not an easy task, I can tell you. Higher education institutions are really struggling to cope with this. But I'm, optimistic that at the end of the day, with some kind of bumps in the road, institutions will be able to resume some kind of normal operation in countries in which the levels of immunization and vaccination are enough in order to resume activities. But at the same time, again, as I mentioned before, if something we have learned of this crisis is that we need to plan more effectively and to be prepared more for contingencies. So, all those, emergency teams that need to be in place in our higher education institutions, it is something that we should have as a permanent activity, not as an ad hoc activity as it happened now.
We all went into crisis mode from 0 to 100 in less than
That's right.
24 hours, I believe.
Yeah.
Francisco, recent research by the British Medical Journal actually found that universities may need to test students every 3 days to prevent major outbreaks. This will definitely require loads of additional resources, a lot of strict processes. However, many would believe that this is the most effective way to minimize the spread of the virus. And not only speaking about higher education institutions, offices as well, with many people around too, will have to do this. But on the other hand, some experts have argued that we simply need to accept a higher level of infection on campuses if we ever want higher education to return to normal. The risk of death for people between the ages of 15 and 24 is extremely low, meaning students would be safe should they contract the virus. So how do you see this playing out? If universities and colleges want to stay open, do they have to accept this level of risk, or should they implement measures to contain as much as possible?
I think institutions should be very cautious about that because one life being lost is a lot, and I don't think we can sacrifice the sort of the collective well-being by those type of individual situations. I think the only thing that institutions should do is to make sure that exceptional cases are properly addressed, including, as you described, in the case of those students that cannot be vaccinated. Of course, putting in place the necessary provisions in order to minimize the risk by making available testing, for those students in a periodic basis. I'm not an expert, of course, on the epidemiological side, but what is the periodicity of those things? It is up to the experts to be decided. But I don't think that as higher education institutions, we can relax on that. In fact, one of the challenges that we have in higher education globally today, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, is what I refer to as a crisis of credibility of our of institutions of our societies. People are skeptical about many of our institutions in society. Governments are skeptical about political parties, are skeptical about companies, and we like it or not, they are skeptical about higher education institutions. So I think we need to be upfront as higher education institutions in be up to the standards and making sure that we regain credibility with our societies by being serious about that. And if there is any place in society in which, we truly value the importance of scientific evidence, they are not doing that. It's like, we are contradicting ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. Let me bring this now back to educational models. I'm interested on this, and I believe our audience as well. IDP found that more than half of international students would consider switching destinations for the change to begin a face-to-face learning as soon as possible. And the pandemic has unleashed financial turmoil on many universities. Institutions have lost millions of dollars, and they're, of course, desperately trying to stay afloat. So, a faster return to campus could definitely boost their enrollments and provide an economic relief. But this raises the question, does a return on the fall mean we're prioritizing revenue generation over the health of students and staff? Like, despite students' clear references, it seems like a mixture of online or in-person classes will continue to be adopted by most institutions at this time. Do you think this hybrid model is currently the safest option?
Of course, it is the safest for sure. And again, something very positive that I think all of us in higher education have learned during the crisis is that it is, that there are advantages as well as disadvantages in the remote delivery of teaching learning, as I mentioned before during my presentation. I think what we in higher education institutions should be concerned about is in assuring that we provide with all the potential restrictions, the best possible educational experience to the students. And if that means that in a particular situation, in a particular case of a country where there are potential peaks into the pandemic, as it has happened recently, even in countries that we were not expecting that this will happen, of course, again, higher education institutions should be acting responsibly in making sure that the most important thing is that the sort of the health of the students and the faculty members and staff are protected. If that means that we should go back to the remote, if that means that we should go back to some kind of hybrid, let's do so. So I don't think that it is a zero-sum game. I don't know if it is about just being closed or open. Some of the slides that very quickly I showed to you in the presentation was about the 15 different scenarios that people, experts on this, are collecting in terms of that. It is not just closing or opening. There are many ways that institutions can sort of reopen in such a way that allow for some kind of educational experience of the student without putting students at risk. Those institutions that have decided to be selective in the courses that can be taken in the face-to-face mode. Institutions that have decided to make modules of learning or blocks of learning, or institutions that have decided to create bubbles of students, like an entire group of students being together all the time, kind of a bubble of isolation, if you want, in terms of the risk of the pandemic. There are institutions that are doing group testing rather than individual testing. So I think, again, if there is a place where we can exercise creativity and innovation, is in our higher education institutions. If we don't do it, most likely nobody else will do it.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that as well. If I could ask you a little bit about the residential model, like this pandemic has also presented a lot of opportunities to reevaluate and reconsider our existing process. And when I say established processes or models, these have been long established. So the pandemic has flipped higher education upside down, and universities definitely had to pivot quickly. But could it be a radical opportunity for a much needed change at this time? And do we really want things to go back to normal?
Well, the risk I see is that, years from now, people will talk about a pandemic that happened at the beginning of the 21st century that, really disrupted the world, and that's it. That at a certain point, life continued the same. And, I am among those who believe that if we don't take this opportunity, which is unique, to
Yes.
really rebuild our building, if you want, of higher education, it will never happen. And I'm sure that, and that's why I was asking at the end of my slides, what are higher education institutions specifically doing? Are we just watching and waiting for the thunderstorm to go away? Or are we just copying what others are doing? Are just we, sitting and waiting for things to magically change? Or are we really prepared and also, again, challenging assumptions and trying to rebuild things? And of course, time will dictate who did the best. I can tell you, at least in our case, that we really took this as the unique opportunity to change many things. So, for instance, in the case of my experience at Qatar Foundation, we took this year to do our entire new higher education strategy, sort of a re-engagement. We were able to put in place and implement things that we never imagined we will be able to do. A new general education program, a much more personalized experience for the students, a program that we call the Universal Skills Passport that provides students with additional knowledge and opportunities for learning that usually are not part of the typical system of higher education. All of those things could not be possible in a time of, I might say, normal time. So the big question for all of us is that, do we want to go back to the normal that had many problems before, that had many inadequacies before, that had many deficiencies before? Or do we want to think about new normal that addresses some of those things? And again, I might be wrong. Most likely, for the majority of institutions, it is a matter of just waiting and then go back to business as usual. But
Yeah.
I hope more, at least the ones that are participating at this webinar, also are intrigued by the idea that if we don't do something different today, innovative, disruptive, it won't be possible to happen after.
Yeah, and with what you say right now, is still there's some higher education experts that believe that the traditional university model where students spend 3 or 4 years living in and around campus is at odds with modern life, if you want to call it this way. And all these rapid advancements in technology means that it's now possible to study almost anywhere with a Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
And if COVID has taught us anything, it's that both students and universities can pivot quickly and adjust to the needs of the modern day. Um, and institutions have made decisions about what elements of the university experience could be scrapped, substituted, or even entirely replaced. So does this prove that the traditional 3 to 4 year residential university system is outdated?
It is outdated, to be honest with you. And there are many things that are outdated. And again, I think the crisis is allowing us to speak very frankly about many of those things. There are many elements of our educational sort of way to do things that are, really outdated. The sequential type of learning we have in our institutions, the very heavy academic contents on precisely on contents rather than in processes, the significant emphasis of our classroom experience, in which basically the idea is that the only one who knows is the teacher and the ones who don't know are the students. This idea, traditional paradigm we have in higher education, in which the role of the teacher is to put in order the students, on top, the one who had the highest sort of score, and then going down to the level, the emphasis on the individualistic learning rather than the collective one. Many of those things today, again, we can talk about that and we can say, this is wrong. Let's try to do something different. And again, there might be many institutions in which they might think like this is totally out of the loop, not related to reality, and they are just waiting for go back to normal and continue with a 4-year educational experience with very limited opportunity of flexibility for students, etc., etc. But also, it is proving that no longer only you can learn in the classroom, that no longer you can learn in front of the teacher, that no longer you can just wait for the typical classroom experience to happen. that there are many more things to do as part of the educational experience. And I think I'm hopeful that at least in some institutions, that particular change is going to happen.
Yeah. Let me ask you something about mocks, because it's popping to my head right now that there's a significant increase in both online programs and mocks off the back of this pandemic. Do you believe that mocks could become more popular than traditional like in-person programs? Like they're cheaper, they're more flexible, and
Have be,
increasingly well respected.
yeah, have become more popular. No question about it. And in fact, I think I was mentioning in my presentation, during the pandemic, nearly 100% of undergraduate and graduate students were learning in online remote things. Let's say companies such as Coursera increase the number of users, 10 times, 7 times, I'm sorry. Blackboard increased the usage 37 times as it was used before. So no, there is no question about that. Now, of course, there are challenges associated with that. One of them has to do, of course, with the recognition of those things that you learn outside of the classroom. Yes. So for a number of institutions, I go back to the case of India, in which they decided that now 20% of the learning in the in the academic program, 20% should be learned using MOOCs, and should be learned the student making decisions about what specific courses he or she wants to study. Of course, confined in the boundaries of the academic program that student is. But of course, the resistance is on institutions which are not yet willing to recognize that students can learn on their own and that can learn probably with more effective teachers than the typical teacher that they have in front of them in the classroom. This is something that, of course, also puts in jeopardy the traditional business model of our higher education institutions, because the assumption is that students take a class for which a teacher and a classroom is being set up, a teacher that is being paid to do that. And then, of course, when you don't have that anymore, that disrupts the whole business model, because the students also can claim that now they don't want to pay the full tuition because a portion of what they are learning is being learned on their own, and that why they have to make all those big payments to the institutions. And of course, all of those things, Jihna, are part of the things that now are putting on the table this discussion about what should be the adequate business model of our higher education institutions, and more important, the adequate academic model of our institutions for the realities of the future that are different to the ones that we experienced in the past.
Yeah. Let me ask you something about my last topic. I wanted to chat about parents and as a parent, and I would speak for myself, I was one of those parents that had to send their son off last fall in the middle of the pandemic to the traditional model of education, and he had to go to campus. So your child is one of the most prized possessions. So sending him off to another country to study can be scary, can be overwhelming. I've never felt so insecure about sending my son in the middle of the pandemic to go on a plane and go to the US, right? So let alone when there's a global pandemic going on. So at Studee, I do have to say we work a lot with involving parents and in every aspect of the information and the decision making process to reassure them that we have their students and their children's best interest at heart. So parents do have a huge influence on when and also where their children study. Do you think parents will feel comfortable sending their children back to college right now?
I think now it is becoming. In fact, I can say that probably there are many parents which are just happily doing that. Uh, there are many parents that now love more than ever teachers and institutions, because, probably they also had been experiencing the hardship of
Yes.
serving not only as parents, but also as educators and coaches and counselors of their kids at home in this very long lockdown that the world has experienced. So now I see, some sense of relief in many places about Okay, let's move on. Let's continue life. And now people feeling more secure, especially now that evidence shows that vaccines are really effective, that vaccines really are reducing the risk of, dying, dramatically. And we are seeing the evidence in many places, even with the new variants of the
Yes.
virus. And which, by the way, I should say, it is one of those remarkable achievements that we are facing in this once in a lifetime situation that we couldn't imagine years ago. The flu, as you know, it took almost 40 years to develop a vaccine. Now it took less than a year to do that. So it is an amazing and remarkable accomplishment, in which, of course, higher education institutions have something to had something to contribute to.
Yeah, the
So, of
flu. I
course,
remember it.
parents are concerned, no question about that, and they should. But at the same time, I see that the majority of parents are feeling much more relief about it. Here again, going back to the microcosmos of Qatar, in last academic year, our higher education institutions, experienced the highest number of applications, because many parents, of course, realized, if they were thinking about sending their kids abroad, that option was not possible. So they said, okay, what are my institutions here? Now we are experiencing in this year also a significant increase, but not as high as was last one, because
Yes.
many parents probably now are thinking not only in our local institutions, but also in institutions from abroad. So I think it is a good signal of the fact that now in those decisions, of course, there is a little bit more of a sense of relief, and also a sense of that, that something, it is becoming much more manageable than what it used to be, a year ago.
Yeah. Francisco, we could just sit here and talk for hours and hours, and I know my time's limited as well. So I'm incredibly grateful for all your insight. I can see we've got 6 questions around. If I could just go through. Nav is asking if things will go back to normal, how long do you think it would take?
Well, normal as it used to be, I don't think we will have ever. I'm sure that there are going to be things that it will not change anymore, and that I might say that it changed, things that changed, but will stay normal, if you want, in the new normal, in comparison to the past. No, the sort of that ideal of a university as we envisioned in the past, I don't think no longer will exist in the future. That's the first point that I like to make. And now, when we will have some kind of normalcy, if we want, with these variations that I mentioned before, I think it is going to be until the next academic year. No, I'm not talking about this upcoming fall, but up to the next one, because also that's when we will see the sort of the impact of the economic recovery in the parts of the world that now are experiencing economic recovery. So the sort of the impact is going to be really happening during the 2022. So
Mhm.
consequently, fall of 2022, in my opinion, is when things will become a little bit more similar to what they used to be. And of course, now we need to be mindful of one situation. Our perspective many times is being dominated by the media about what is
Yes.
happening in countries in which things are becoming much more manageable. But think about the case that, unfortunately, that is not what it is happening in all the world. In fact, very close to here, unfortunately, we are seeing what is happening in South Asia, where I used to be before,
Yes.
in which we are seeing, unprecedented levels of contagious, and of course also of unfortunately deaths in India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, just to mention the countries in the region. And also, of course, be mindful of the fact that, in the entire continents, let's say, for instance, in the African continent, still vaccination is not happening. The number of people that have been vaccinated is really nil, negligible. So, and we need, in the increasingly interconnected world in which we live, and the pandemic has been, teaching about that, we can no longer ignore that by saying, we are safe, who cares about the others?
Yes.
Because all of us are on the same ship. And of course, that's where also we need to exercise as society. And of course, we as higher education institutions can do a lot on this, to exercise more solidarity in making sure that what we are seeing that is working in a portion of the world also should be affordable and available to the rest of the world.
Yes, yes. I've got two really interesting questions, and actually one is a comment that I'm taking a look at. Kathleen is asking if you could describe some of the innovations or changes that higher ed should adopt post-pandemic. And her comment also goes that students report not wanting online learning and wanting to have a residential in-person experience, because other students also report that their internet connections are inadequate for
Mhm.
online learning. Could you address a little bit on this?
Well, yeah, of course. You may remember that one of the key challenges we had ahead is how do we, first of all, how do we mitigate the learning deficit that already had happened?
Yes.
Think about a student who has been a year and a half experiencing education online. No doubt about it that she or he is experiencing fatigue. It's totally bored, I might say,
And
and
especially
then
wherever they are in the world, because if you have a
exactly,
long time zone difference.
well, and also, of course, that many, as I mentioned before, 40% of students globally are not being able to continue education. They don't have the connectivity that is needed. They don't have the capacity to connect. And of course, that learning deficit is there. And unfortunately, even if we do the greatest effort in the world possible, we know that a significant portion of that deficit will not be recovered, unfortunately. So that's the challenge one. Challenge two is, how do we assure connectivity
Yeah.
where it is not possible? And I have seen remarkable cases in different countries. I saw cases in Brazil, cases in Mexico, of even institutions doing an extra effort in order to help and support connectivity, doing deals with internet providers in making affordable connectivity for students in remote areas, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, even despite those efforts, that is a reality that we are facing today. Teachers also were not properly prepared to transition into becoming, teachers in the digital pedagogies, if you want. So,
Yes.
what are some of those changes that we will see? And I hope that can even stay and become much more possible. The possibility of, as I was mentioning before, reducing the exposure of the students in sort of reducing the micro learning in a much more effective way,
Mhm.
clustering knowledge in different pockets of learning, if you want, providing more flexibility to the students to study on their own and to do much more flipped learning in our classrooms, in our virtual and face-to-face classrooms, are
Yes.
some of those innovations that we know that work, that what we need to make sure is that we institutionalize them in order to make that possible for the students. Now, are we ready for that in our higher education institutions? I can tell you about the many cases of institutions in which they are really committed to work on that. But also, there are many, and I might say it unfortunately, the majority, which are just saying, don't worry, just wait, and then let's go back to business as usual.
Yeah, it is impossible to predict when, how, or if a university life will be normal, if we want to call it that way, if we'll ever be normal again. But what we do know is that there's an appetite for international students. International education remains, and we won't stop until every student has had the opportunity to study abroad. Francisco, muchas gracias. Thank you very much for sharing your insight and your thoughts with us. I'm pretty sure the audience has enjoyed as much as I have. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. I know we can stay for hours here, and I'm sure we've all learned a lot from your insight. Thank you
You're
to
very welcome.
everyone who's attended. We really enjoy it, and I hope you have some key takeaways from this session as well. Francisco, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gina. It has been a pleasure. And of course, you can, those interested in having a copy of my slides, just send me an email or send me a tweet, and I will be delighted to send you the slides in a more detail so you can take a look to that. And it has been a real pleasure, Gina, having this conversation with you. For sure, I can
Likewise.
tell you that for every complex problem that we have talked about, we know that there is an easy solution, but of course that solution might be wrong. So I'm sure that the audience, the participants, if now they are more confused than what they were before, I think we achieved the objective of this session.
That's great. Francisco, take good care of yourself. It's been great to see you, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar.
My pleasure. Take care.
Take good care. Goodbye, and thank you,
Bye
everyone.
bye.